everyone. Today I would like to talk about facial morphology and how it differs among different age and ethnic groups. Before I begin, I would like to give a brief overview of what I'll be talking about in the next few minutes. I will be going over some studies that performed research on anthropometric or craniofacial measurements on different groups of people. One study looked at the differences in measurements among different age groups. Two other studies compared how the measurements differed among different ethnic groups. I will talk briefly about their methods and the main findings of their studies. Also, I will discuss the significance of studying facial morphology at the end of this presentation. The title of the first study is Anthropometric Measurements of the Facial Framework in Adulthood, Age-Related Changes in 8 Age Categories in 600 Healthy White North Americans of the European ancestry from 16 to 90 years of age. The aim of this study was to determine age-related changes of the facial framework during adulthood. "600 white North Americans of European ancestry with ages between 16 through 70 years were the subjects of this study. They were divided into 7 groups, and measurement results were compared between each groups. 5 measurements were taken from both the skin and bony surfaces, so a total of 10 measurements were taken. 4 horizontal and 1 vertical measurements were taken. Also, the thickness of soft tissue cover was measured. The figure on the right is an example of anthropometric measurement. These are the anthropometric landmarks of the facial framework. The topmost horizontal line refers to the width of the forehead. The second horizontal line below is the upper face width. Following that is the mid-face width, and the last horizontal line is the lower face width. The vertical line is the face height. Some key findings are as follows. The forehead width increased significantly from the maturation period of 16 through 20 years to early adulthood of 21 to 40 years. There was also an increase in mid-face width and lower face width with age. The soft tissue cover thickness was found to be greatest in the mid-face. Some trends observed in each age groups are as follows. In early adulthood, the lower jaw was wider in male than female, and the maxilla was narrower in female. In middle adulthood, a decrease in maxilla width was observed in males. In females, decrease in maxilla widths were observed, but on the skin surface only. An increase in face height was observed in males at the bony surface. Lastly, in late adulthood, a decrease in forehead width was observed in females and increase in lower jaw width of males on the bony surface only. The authors have concluded that their data serves as an approximate guide in preliminary quantitative analysis of bony framework of the face. The next paper I read about is called The Comparison of Craniofacial Measurements of Young Adult African American and North American White Males and Females. The aim of the study was to identify differences between the craniofacial measurements between the two races and determine the need for craniofacial norms. The subjects of the study were 18 to 25 years old, and only the measurements of the African American group were collected. These results were compared with already published measurements for North American whites. A total of 51 anthropometric measurements were taken: 9 cranial, 10 facial, 8 orbital, 14 nasal, 4 oral, and 6 auricular. Now let's look at what each of the measurements are. The 12 basic vertical measurements are labeled on this figure. The craniofacial height is labeled number 1. Number 2 is the morphologic height of the face. 3 is the height of the lower face. 4 is the anterior height of the head. 5 is the height of the mandible. 6 is the height of the nose. 7 is the lower lip height. 8 is the height of the forehead. 9 is the height of the upper lip. 10 is the height of the chin. 11 is the height of the calvarium. And lastly, 12, distance between the vertex and tracheon. These are the 8 horizontal measurements. This figure shows the inclination measurements, starting with the inclination of the forehead. The second one is the inclination of the upper face. The next one, number 3, is the inclination of the lower face. Fourth one is the inclination of the nasal bridge. Fifth one is the inclination of the medial longitudinal axis of the ear. And lastly, the orbital measurements. They performed 4 orbital measurements. The first one is the height of the eye fissure. Second one is the intercanthal width. Third one is the biocular width. And the fourth one is the eye fissure length. Significant differences in the orbital and nasal region were observed. No significant difference was found in horizontal measurements, and few differences were found in the auricular region. The differences between groups were greater among females, and the authors assume that the reason for this is probably due to the greater number of female subjects. meaning there's more statistical power to detect smaller differences, especially in the face as well as in nose and eyes. The results of the study offer clear evidence that separate norms regarding craniofacial measurements are needed for African Americans, considering the differences in various regions. The last paper I am about to summarize is another study on facial measurement of different ethnic groups. The aims of this study include establishing the normal range measurements of the craniofacial complex in all ethnic groups included in the study. Also, they compared these measurements with the normal range of North American white measurements. Lastly, they identified measurements that contribute most to the anthropometric quality of the facial region. Measurements were taken from a total of 1,470 subjects from all parts of the world. The database of the North American white population was used as the reference group. 14 anthropometric measurements were taken, and I will show you what they are in the next 2 slides. The authors divided the measurements into 2 main categories, and the first one is the lateral aspect, which includes the forehead height, physiognomical face height, morphological face height, lower face height, nose height, inclination of the nasal bridge, and lastly, the length of the auricle. The other method is the measurement of the frontal aspect of the face, the intercanthal width, biocular width, eye fissure length, face width, mandible width, morphological nose width, and mouth width. Also, you should know that the 10 measurements that the authors have collected are the same measurements used by Leonardo da Vinci. Here are some major findings of the study. Compared to North American white group, or the reference group, the orbital regions showed greatest variations. European Caucasians were closest to the reference group as expected. The bizygomatic width was significantly greater in Caucasian males and Asians. The mandible widths were significantly greater in Asian and Caucasian females. The nose widths were significantly wider in Asian and Black groups. The Middle Eastern group had similar nose widths but much higher nose heights than the reference group. The authors of the study mention that some theories that possibly explain for the differences in facial morphology among different ethnic groups are actually unproven. The known factors are environment, socioeconomic status, and nutritional habits. However, based on the fact that African Americans who lived in North America for centuries still had wider nose widths than the North American whites, shows that only genetics can explain the differences in facial morphology. All 3 papers that I have discussed basically have the same purpose, and that is to establish the norm for different age groups and ethnic groups in order to provide guidance to dysmorphologists, geneticists, plastic surgeons, and any other professionals who might benefit from it. By doing so, they can plan appropriate therapy or surgical procedures and apply these anthropometric norms. I have done some research on the recent studies of this topic and found that some studies have applied deep learning in the process of identifying facial features. This is not new actually, but I thought it would be interesting to share some of the topics for recently published papers. A paper published in 2020 claims that beauty can be predicted by using deep learning. Their results showed that their proposed network can predict facial beauty from a human point of view. Also, another study published in 2019 claims that facial recognition can be done even using imperfect data. This suggests that we can expand the level of facial morphology studies and possibly use it to discover new findings regarding facial morphology. This is the end of my presentation on facial morphology. Thank you for listening.